Sometimes the people we dismiss the fastest are the ones carrying the pieces of our past. The wine glass stopped halfway to Richard Calloway's lips. Around him, the imperial room continued glowing beneath crystal chandeliers and soft golden light, untouched by the moment that had suddenly stolen the breath from his chest. Expensive silverware clinked softly. A pianist played somewhere near the marble staircase. Outside the towering windows, rain slid slowly down the Manhattan skyline like melted glass. But Richard no longer heard any of it. His eyes were locked on the young waitress standing beside the table. Claire Bennett lowered her gaze politely as she adjusted the folded white napkin near Ethan Calloway's plate. Her movements were calm, precise, invisible in the way only service workers learn to become after years of being ignored by wealthy strangers. She wore the restaurant's black uniform without jewelry except for a thin silver chain hidden beneath her collar. A small strand of blonde hair had slipped loose beside her cheek, but she didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care anymore. "Excuse me," Ethan said coldly without looking at her. "This steak is medium. I asked for medium rare." Claire glanced down once. "I apologize, sir. I'll have the kitchen remake it immediately." Her voice was soft, educated, steady enough to make Ethan finally look up from his phone for half a second. "You people always say that," he muttered. "And somehow it still comes back wrong." The two investors sitting beside him laughed politely, eager to please the 34-year-old CO, whose signature could move millions of dollars before breakfast. Claire nodded once. No argument, no expression. She simply reached for the plate. But before she could lift it, Richard suddenly spoke. "Wait." The entire table paused. Ethan frowned slightly. "Dad." Richard didn't answer. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on Claire's face with growing confusion, almost fear. The old billionaire looked as though someone had reached inside him and reopened a wound that had never fully healed. Claire stood still beneath his stare. "Have we met before?" Richard asked quietly. Ethan exhaled impatiently. "She's a waitress, Dad." The words landed harder than he intended. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the plate. Just for a second, then relaxed again. "No, sir," she answered gently. "I don't believe we have." Richard swallowed hard. There was something hauntingly familiar about her eyes. Not just the color, the sadness behind them. The kind that arrived too early in life and never fully left. Ethan leaned back in his chair, checking his Swiss watch. "Can we not do this right now? We're in the middle of a deal." But Richard barely heard him. Claire stepped back politely. "I'll correct the order immediately." She turned to leave when the silver chain beneath her collar slipped loose for the briefest moment. A small pendant caught the chandelier light. A silver swan. Richard froze completely. The color drained from his face so suddenly that one of the investors lowered his glass in concern. "Mr. Calloway?" Richard stood up, so abruptly his chair scraped across the marble floor. Nearby conversations stopped one by one as heads slowly turned toward the table. Ethan stared at his father in disbelief. "Dad, what the hell?" Richard's voice cracked before the sentence fully formed. "Where did you get that necklace?" Claire instinctively touched the pendant beneath her collar. Her calm expression shifted for the first time all evening. Not panic. Something quieter. Older. Like a memory she had spent years trying not to disturb. "My mother gave it to me," she said softly. Richard looked as though the room had disappeared around him. And for the first time in Ethan Calloway's life, he saw his father staring at someone not with power, but with regret. The rain hit the streets of Manhattan in long silver lines as Claire Bennett stepped out through the employee entrance behind the Imperial Room. Cold wind curled around the alleyway, carrying the distant sound of traffic and sirens somewhere downtown. She pulled her thin wool coat tighter around herself and stood still for a moment beneath the flickering yellow light above the back door. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the weather, from the look on Richard Calloway's face. Claire closed her eyes briefly. She had seen recognition before. Small moments, passing glances, people searching her features for someone they once knew. But never like that. Never with that kind of pain. The silver swan pendant rested cold against her skin as she walked toward the subway station 3 blocks away. The city moved around her without noticing. Men in dark coats hurried beneath umbrellas. Steam rose from the sidewalk vents. Taxi horns echoed through the wet night. New York never stopped moving long enough to care who was hurting. Claire understood that years ago. Her apartment sat above a laundromat in Queens. barely 400 square feet with old radiators that clanged through the night and windows that let winter air slip through the edges. It was not much, but it was hers. She unlocked the door quietly just after midnight and found the lamp beside the couch still glowing. An elderly woman slept there beneath a faded blanket, television murmuring softly in the background. Eleanor Bennett opened her eyes almost instantly. "You are late," she whispered. Claire forced a small smile. "Busy night." Eleanor studied her daughter carefully. Even at 68, illness had not weakened the sharpness in her pale eyes. Something happened. Claire hesitated while removing her shoes near the door. "I met someone." Eleanor slowly sat upright. The movement alone seemed to cost energy these days. "Who?" Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the silver pendant, staring at it for a long moment before answering. "Richard Calloway." Silence filled the apartment. Heavy. Absolute. Even the old television suddenly seemed too loud. Eleanor's face lost all color. "No," she whispered. Claire nodded once. "He recognized the necklace." Eleanor looked away immediately, toward the rain tapping softly against the window glass. Her fingers tightened around the blanket in her lap. "After all these years," she murmured quietly, almost to herself. Claire sat down across from her mother at the tiny kitchen table. "You knew this could happen one day." "No," Eleanor said softly. "I knew this could destroy everything one day." Claire lowered her eyes. The old clock above the stove ticked unevenly in the silence between them. "He looked at me like he had seen a ghost." Eleanor gave a sad smile. Maybe he had. Claire wanted answers. Questions she had carried her entire life pressed against her chest like stones. Why had Richard disappeared? Why had her mother spent 26 years avoiding his name? Why did one wealthy family in Manhattan seem connected to every painful silence in their lives? But Eleanor only looked tired now, older than she had that morning. "Did he know about me?" Claire finally asked. Her mother did not answer immediately. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the East River. Eleanor stared down at her trembling hands before speaking in the quietest voice Claire had ever heard from her. "The last time Richard Calloway saw me," she said slowly, "you were not even born yet." Claire felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, not shock, something deeper. The feeling of standing near a truth that had waited years to be spoken aloud. Eleanor looked up finally, her eyes shining with old regret. "And if his son is anything like the man Richard used to be," she whispered, "then tonight was only the beginning." The next morning arrived gray and cold over Manhattan. Rainwater still clung to the sidewalks as black SUVs lined the entrance of Callaway International like polished shadows waiting beneath the steel towers of Midtown. Ethan Callaway stepped out of the elevator on the 43rd floor with the same sharp confidence he carried into every room. Navy suit, silver tie, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. Employees straightened the moment they saw him. Assistants lowered their voices. The building itself seemed designed around his presence. But something about the previous night still irritated him in ways he could not explain. His father had barely spoken during the drive home from the restaurant. Richard Calloway, a man known for controlling billion-dollar negotiations without blinking, had sat silently in the back seat staring out at the rain like someone trapped inside an old memory. Ethan hated mysteries he could not solve. "Good morning, sir," his assistant Vanessa said carefully as he entered the executive conference room. "Your father is already here." Ethan frowned immediately. Richard was never early. When Ethan stepped inside, he found his father standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A file folder rested unopened on the table beside him. Richard looked older this morning. Not physically, emotionally, like sleep had never touched him. "You wanted to see me?" Ethan asked. Richard turned slowly. "That waitress." Ethan sighed under his breath. "Dad, seriously? Her name is Claire Bennett." Ethan tossed his phone onto the table. "I do not know why you are suddenly obsessed with a server from a restaurant." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Because I knew someone once who looked exactly like her mother." The room fell quiet. Ethan stared at him for a moment before giving a short, disbelieving laugh. "That is what this is about. An old girlfriend." Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window again. Below them, New York moved in endless motion. Yellow taxis, steam rising from the streets, tiny people crossing intersections unaware of the lives changing far above them. 30 years ago, Richard said quietly, Before your mother died, before this company became what it is now, there was someone else. Ethan felt irritation rise instantly. His father never spoke about personal things. Never. Richard Calloway had built his empire on discipline, silence, and control. Hearing vulnerability in his voice felt unnatural. Dangerous even. Her name was Eleanor Bennett. Richard continued softly. She worked at a train station cafe in Boston while finishing nursing school. Ethan leaned back slowly against the conference table. You are telling me the waitress is connected to you? Richard closed his eyes briefly. I do not know. But the way he said it made clear that he already feared the answer. Ethan crossed his arms. So what exactly do you want me to do? Run a background check on every waitress in Manhattan, because she looks familiar? Richard turned sharply. Do not speak about her like that. The sudden edge in his father's voice surprised both of them. Ethan went still. Richard rarely raised his voice, which somehow made moments like this worse. You embarrassed her last night, Richard said quietly now. You spoke to her like she was invisible. Ethan gave a cold smile. She works in hospitality. That is literally her job. Richard stared at him for a long moment. There was disappointment in his eyes now. Heavy. Personal. That is the problem, Ethan, he said softly. You have spent so many years being served that you no longer recognize dignity unless it arrives in a tailored suit. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Richard reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn from time. He placed it carefully onto the conference table. Ethan looked down. A young woman stood smiling beside a snowy train platform, her blonde hair caught by the winter wind. Around her neck hung a silver swan pendant, the exact same one Claire Bennett wore beneath her collar. Claire arrived at the Imperial Room just before 5 in the evening as the last traces of rain faded from the city streets. The restaurant glowed softly beneath warm amber lights, polished glasses catching reflections like tiny stars across the dark velvet walls. Wealth lived comfortably here. Quietly. Expensively. Men discussed investments over $1,200 bottles of wine, while women in designer coats laughed behind careful smiles. Claire moved through the room unnoticed, just as she always had. Her black uniform was freshly pressed despite the long subway ride from Queens. Her hair was tied neatly back. The silver swan pendant rested hidden beneath her collar again. Invisible. Safe. At least that was what she told herself. Table 12 requested you specifically. The hostess whispered while handing Claire a menu tablet. Claire paused. Requested me? The Calloways. Her stomach tightened instantly. Across the room, Ethan Calloway sat beside the long window overlooking 52nd Street. Richard sat across from him, quieter tonight, his posture heavy with thought. Ethan noticed Claire first. His expression did not soften. If anything, it became colder, more controlled. Claire approached the table professionally. Good evening. Welcome back. Ethan barely looked up from the documents beside his wine glass. Sparkling water. No lemon this time. Claire nodded once. Of course, sir. Richard watched her carefully. Not like a customer. Like a man trying to piece together fragments of a life he had lost years ago. Claire could feel it every second she stood there. And for you, Mr. Calloway? She asked gently. Richard looked at her for a long moment before answering. Tea. Ethan raised an eyebrow immediately. Tea. Richard kept his eyes on Claire. Chamomile. Claire wrote the order down quietly and turned toward the kitchen. But Ethan's voice stopped her. Actually, he said calmly, we will need another server tonight. Claire slowly looked back at him. The nearby tables seemed to grow quieter without meaning to. Ethan folded his hands neatly. My father appears uncomfortable. I would prefer someone else handle the table. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the tablet. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Richard noticed. Ethan, he warned quietly. It is fine. Claire interrupted gently before the situation could grow worse. Her voice stayed calm. Almost kind. I understand. Ethan finally looked directly at her then. Something about her composure irritated him more than anger would have. She did not defend herself. Did not argue. Did not act offended. She simply accepted the humiliation with a grace that made him feel strangely exposed. Claire handed the tablet to another waitress nearby and stepped away from the table without another word. Richard watched her disappear toward the back hallway beside the wine cellar. What exactly are you doing? He asked quietly once she was gone. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Protecting this dinner from becoming emotional theater. Richard stared at his son with disappointment, so visible it almost changed the air between them. You think this is about emotion? Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. A waitress wearing the same necklace as someone you dated 30 years ago does not suddenly make her family. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. You did not see her mother. Ethan said nothing. Richard reached slowly into his coat pocket and unfolded the old photograph again beneath the chandelier light. The young woman smiling in the snow looked hauntingly alive even after all these years. Eleanor Bennett disappeared 2 days after this picture was taken, Richard said softly. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. Ethan frowned slightly despite himself. And you never found her? Richard shook his head once. I searched for years. Silence settled heavily over the table. In the distance, soft piano music drifted through the restaurant, while glasses clinked quietly beneath golden light. The entire room still looked beautiful, elegant, untouched. But Ethan suddenly realized his father was trembling slightly as he held the photograph. There is something else, Richard admitted quietly. Ethan looked up. Richard swallowed hard before speaking again. The last letter Eleanor ever sent me mentioned she was pregnant. Claire stood alone beside the service counter while the restaurant carried on around her as if nothing had changed. Plates moved in careful rhythm beneath warm chandelier light. Waiters crossed polished floors with trained smiles. Glasses clinked softly against silver. The imperial room remained elegant, controlled. But inside Claire, something old had started shaking loose. You okay? Asked Naomi, another waitress balancing 2 champagne flutes on a tray. Claire nodded automatically. I am fine. Naomi glanced toward the Callaway table near the windows. That younger one is rude. Claire gave the smallest smile. He is important. Important people are usually in a hurry. Naomi leaned closer. No, wealthy people are in a hurry. There is a difference. Before Claire could answer, the kitchen bell rang sharply behind them. Another order ready. Another table waiting. Another excuse to keep moving instead of thinking. Claire reached for a tray, grateful for the distraction. But her mind stayed trapped on Richard's face when he had spoken about Eleanor. Pregnant. The word echoed quietly through her thoughts like footsteps in an empty hallway. Her mother had never told her much about Richard Callaway. Only fragments. Small unfinished stories told late at night when the apartment lights were dim and the past felt safer in the dark. Claire remembered being 8 years old, sitting on the kitchen counter while Eleanor stitched the loose sleeve on her school sweater. Did my father leave us? Claire had asked carefully. Eleanor's hands had gone still for several seconds before answering. No, she whispered softly. Life separated us before he even knew how to stay. At the time, Claire had not understood the difference. Now she wondered if her mother had spent 26 years protecting Richard or protecting herself. Claire. The voice pulled her back instantly. Ethan stood several feet away near the hallway entrance, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Up close, he looked exhausted tonight. The sharp confidence he carried like armor had begun cracking around the edges. Claire straightened professionally. Can I help you, sir? Ethan glanced briefly toward the dining room to make sure his father could not hear them. I need to ask you something. Claire waited calmly. Ethan studied her face carefully now, as if trying to see what his father saw. How long have you worked here? Almost 3 years. Before that, a bookstore in Queens. Ethan frowned slightly. And your mother? Claire's posture changed almost invisibly. Guarded now. Why are you asking about my mother? Ethan hesitated. It annoyed him that he did not have a simple answer. His entire life had been built on certainty, decisions, numbers, facts. Yet standing beside this quiet waitress somehow made him feel strangely unprepared. Because my father has barely slept since meeting you, he admitted finally. And I have never seen him react this way to anyone. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Then perhaps you should ask him why. Ethan studied her for another long moment. Did your mother ever mention Richard Callaway? Claire looked back at him quietly. There was no anger in her expression, only caution learned from years of surviving disappointment. She mentioned him once, she said softly. A long time ago. Ethan felt his heartbeat shift slightly. What did she say? Claire glanced toward the rain-covered windows at the far end of the restaurant. Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass in blurred lights and reflections. She said some people spend their entire lives loving each other, Claire answered quietly, and still end up as strangers. Ethan said nothing. For the first time since becoming CEO of Callaway International, He felt completely outside his own understanding of the world. Claire adjusted the tray in her hands gently. Was there anything else you needed, Mr. Calloway? Ethan almost answered automatically. But then he noticed something small near her wrist as the sleeve of her uniform shifted. A faded scar. Thin, barely visible, old enough to belong to childhood. Claire immediately lowered her sleeve again. Ethan frowned slightly. What happened to your wrist? Claire's eyes met his for one brief second before she spoke. Winter train accident, she said softly. When I was 5, back in the dining room. Richard suddenly stood up, so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. Richard Calloway crossed the restaurant floor faster than anyone had ever seen him move. Conversations softened around him as guests quietly turned their heads beneath the golden chandelier light. Ethan stood frozen near the hallway entrance while Claire instinctively stepped back, confused by the sudden panic in Richard's expression. What did you say? Richard asked breathlessly. Claire looked startled. I said I was in a train accident when I was 5. Richard's face had gone completely pale now. The old billionaire looked as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. Boston, he whispered. Claire frowned slightly. Outside Boston. During winter. Richard closed his eyes for one painful second. Ethan stared between them, his pulse beginning to rise. Dad. Richard ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Claire's wrist. Your scar, he said quietly. Left side. Near the vein. Claire slowly lowered the tray in her hands. How would you know that? Richard swallowed hard. The piano music in the dining room suddenly felt impossibly distant. Because I was there. Silence. Complete. Heavy. Nearby guests stopped pretending not to listen. Even the waitstaff moved more slowly now, sensing something fragile unfolding in the middle of the restaurant. Claire's voice became almost a whisper. What? Richard's eyes glistened beneath the soft amber light. The train derailed during a snowstorm, he said quietly. Your mother was trapped beside one of the damaged cars. I remember carrying a little girl through the smoke and snow while she cried for her mother. Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. Ethan felt his stomach drop as pieces began connecting faster than he could stop them. That was you? Claire asked softly. Richard nodded once. You had a small red coat with missing buttons. Claire's breath caught. Her mother had kept that coat for years folded carefully inside an old cedar chest beneath their bed. And your wrist was bleeding. Richard continued quietly. You kept apologizing because you thought you had ruined someone's watch with your blood. Claire stared at him in shock. She had never told anyone that story. Not once. Because she barely remembered it herself. Only flashes. Snow falling sideways in the wind. Her mother screaming her name. A man lifting her into his arms beneath flashing emergency lights. Ethan looked at Claire now with something entirely different in his eyes. Not curiosity anymore. Recognition. Humanity. Richard stepped closer carefully, as though afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. After the accident, Eleanor vanished, he said softly. I searched every hospital in Massachusetts. Every address I had for her. But she was gone. Claire lowered her eyes. She said leaving was the only way to survive. Richard looked like the words physically hurt him. Ethan finally spoke. Why would she leave if she loved you? Richard gave a broken smile, without looking away from Claire. Because sometimes people think disappearing hurts less than being abandoned. Claire felt emotion rising dangerously inside her chest now. Years of silence. Questions. Missing pieces. All standing suddenly beneath chandelier light, while strangers watched from nearby tables pretending not to stare. My mother never hated you, Claire admitted quietly. She just stopped believing you would come. Richard covered his mouth briefly, overcome by something he had spent decades burying beneath wealth and business and control. Ethan had never seen his father like this. Not once in his entire life. The powerful man who negotiated billion-dollar mergers without emotion now looked shattered by a waitress standing in a black uniform, holding an empty serving tray. Claire glanced down instinctively, uncomfortable with everyone watching her private life unravel in public. Ethan noticed immediately. For the first time since meeting her, he suddenly understood something simple and devastating. She had spent her entire life carrying pain quietly, while people like him barely noticed she existed. Richard slowly reached into his wallet with trembling hands and removed a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age from years of being carried everywhere. I kept this with me for 26 years, he whispered. Claire looked down as he carefully unfolded the letter. Her mother's handwriting covered the page. Claire stared at the folded letter in Richard Calloway's trembling hands as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime inside a single page. The restaurant around them had gone unnaturally quiet now. Even the pianist near the staircase had slowed his music to something softer, almost hesitant, as if the room itself could feel the fragility of the moment unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Richard carefully handed the letter toward her. "I read it every year on December 17th, he said quietly. The day she disappeared. Claire hesitated before taking it. The paper felt delicate with age, edges softened by time and repeated handling. She recognized her mother's handwriting instantly. Small, careful, elegant in the way people wrote before computers replaced letters with screens. Claire unfolded the page slowly while Ethan watched from beside his father in complete silence. "Richard," she began reading softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you are reading this, then I have already left Boston. I know you will try to find me. Please do not." Richard lowered his eyes. Claire continued, "Your family already made their position very clear. A waitress carrying your child would destroy the future they built for you." Ethan's head lifted immediately. "What?" Richard closed his eyes briefly. "My father." Claire looked up slowly. Richard's voice sounded distant now, buried beneath old regret. He believed wealth should only marry wealth. Eleanor worked at the station cafe. To him, that made her temporary. Ethan felt shame crawl quietly into his chest. Temporary. The words sounded ugly now. Too familiar. Claire continued reading. "You once told me kindness mattered more than status. I believed you. But powerful families do not survive on kindness, Richard. They survive on silence." Richard's hands trembled slightly beside him. Claire swallowed hard before reading the final lines. "I will raise our daughter far away from your world because I do not want her growing up feeling invisible beside people who only respect money. If life is kinder to us in another lifetime, perhaps we will meet again without fear standing between us." Claire lowered the letter slowly. Her eyes glistened beneath the chandelier light, but she did not cry. Years of quiet endurance had taught her how to carry emotion without letting it break her posture. Ethan stared at the letter in disbelief. "Grandfather knew?" Richard nodded once, exhausted. "He paid someone at the hospital after the accident to tell Eleanor I had chosen my future over her." Claire's breath caught softly. "My mother thought you abandoned us." Richard looked at her with unbearable sadness. "And I thought she stopped loving me." The silence between them felt enormous now. 26 years. Entire lives shaped by one cruel decision made by people who viewed status as more important than human hearts. Ethan looked toward Claire slowly. For the first time since meeting her, he no longer saw a waitress standing in a black uniform. He saw the invisible damage power could leave behind when people used it carelessly. Claire folded the letter carefully along its old creases before handing it back to Richard. "She kept your photograph," Claire admitted quietly. Richard looked stunned. "What?" Claire gave the faintest smile. "Inside a cedar box under her bed, wrapped in a blue scarf." Richard covered his mouth briefly, overwhelmed by emotion. "All these years," he whispered. Claire nodded once. "She never stopped loving you." Ethan looked away toward the rain-covered windows. Shame settled heavily inside him now, deeper than simple guilt. He remembered every dismissive word he had spoken to Claire since the moment she approached their table. Every careless glance. Every assumption. And suddenly he understood the cruel irony with painful clarity. He had become exactly like the grandfather he barely respected. A man who measured human worth before learning human stories. Claire adjusted the sleeve near her wrist quietly. "I should get back to work." Richard stepped forward instinctively. "Claire, wait." She paused politely. Richard's voice cracked slightly beneath the weight of everything he had lost. "Did Eleanor ever tell you what I wanted to name our daughter?" Claire slowly shook her head. Richard smiled sadly through wet eyes. "Grace," he whispered. "Because even back then, your mother said Grace was the one thing this world never deserved enough of." Claire returned to work because that was what survival taught people to do. No matter how deeply life shook them, bills still arrived. Tables still needed clearing. Customers still expected smiling service beneath warm restaurant lights. So she carried trays through the imperial room with the same calm posture she always had, even while her heartbeat refused to settle. But everything felt different now. The room that once ignored her suddenly watched her carefully. Conversations softened when she passed nearby. Guests glanced toward the Callaway table with discreet curiosity. Wealth loved mystery almost as much as it loved gossip. Claire hated both. Near the kitchen entrance, Naomi caught her arm gently. "What is happening out there?" Claire gave a tired smile. "I honestly do not know." But deep down, she did know. The past had finally found her. And there was no graceful way to stop it now. Across the restaurant, Ethan sat alone at the table while Richard stepped outside onto the covered terrace to take a phone call. The city skyline shimmered through rain-covered glass behind him. Ethan barely noticed. His eyes kept drifting toward Claire, moving quietly between tables. Every detail he once ignored suddenly stood out painfully clearly. The way she thanked the dishwasher carrying heavy trays. The way she knelt slightly beside an elderly customer who struggled hearing the menu. The way she remained gentle even when exhausted. Ethan realized something uncomfortable then. Claire had shown more grace in one difficult evening than most executives in his company showed in an entire year. And he had treated her like furniture. He stood slowly from the table before he could change his mind. Claire was refilling water glasses near a corner booth when she sensed him approaching. "Mr. Callaway," she said politely without looking up. Ethan stopped beside her. "Claire." His voice sounded different tonight. Less sharp, less certain. Claire placed the pitcher down carefully. "Can I help you with something?" Ethan hesitated longer than a man like him normally would. "I owe you an apology." Claire finally looked at him. He seemed uncomfortable saying the words, which somehow made them feel more honest. "You do not owe me anything," she answered softly. "Yes, I do." The rain tapped quietly against the tall windows beside them. Ethan lowered his voice. "I spent 2 days speaking to you like you mattered less because of your uniform." Claire's expression remained calm, but something vulnerable flickered briefly in her eyes before disappearing again. "You were not the first person," she said gently. The simplicity of the sentence hit Ethan harder than anger could have. "That almost makes it worse," he admitted quietly. Claire studied him for a moment. "Why?" Ethan gave a small, humorless laugh. "Because I always believed I was better than men like my grandfather." Silence settled softly between them. Claire adjusted the sleeve near her wrist again, an unconscious habit Ethan had started noticing. "Power changes people," she said quietly. "Sometimes so slowly they do not realize it." Ethan looked down briefly. "My father spent years trying not to become his father. I think somewhere along the way, I became both." Claire could hear genuine regret in his voice now. Not performative guilt. Something heavier. More human. She reached for the water pitcher again. "People are more than their worst moment, Mr. Callaway." Ethan watched her carefully. "You still call me Mr. Callaway?" Claire gave the faintest smile. "You still call me Claire instead of Waitress." Progress takes time. For the first time that evening, Ethan almost smiled back. But before either of them could speak again, the restaurant entrance opened sharply behind them. Cold wind swept briefly through the room as a woman in an elegant ivory coat stepped inside beneath the chandelier light. Tall, composed, beautiful in the controlled way old money often looked. Her eyes found Ethan immediately. "There you are," she said smoothly while removing leather gloves. Then she noticed Claire standing beside him, and the warmth disappeared from her face almost instantly. "Why?" the woman asked slowly. "Is a server standing in the middle of your private conversation?" Claire stepped back automatically. But Ethan did not move. Because for the first time in his life, he suddenly heard how cruel that sentence truly sounded. The woman removed her coat slowly while the maitre d' rushed forward to greet her with nervous politeness. "Good evening, Miss Ashford." Claire lowered her eyes immediately, recognizing the name before Ethan even spoke. Victoria Ashford, daughter of a banking empire, board member at Callaway International. The woman every business magazine in Manhattan quietly expected Ethan to marry one day. Victoria's heels clicked softly across the marble floor as she approached them beneath the chandelier light. Everything about her looked controlled, elegant, expensive, but her eyes remained fixed on Claire with open disapproval. Ethan straightened slightly. "Victoria, I was not expecting you." Clearly, her gaze flickered briefly toward Claire's serving tray before returning to Ethan. "Your assistant said you canceled tonight's investor dinner halfway through dessert. I assumed something serious had happened." Claire stepped back politely. "Excuse me." But Victoria's voice stopped her before she could leave. "Actually, I would like sparkling water." Claire turned back professionally. "Of course. No ice." Victoria offered the sentence without even looking directly at her. The old version of Ethan would not have noticed anything wrong with that interaction. Tonight, he noticed everything. The dismissal, the tone, the invisible line wealthy people drew between themselves and those serving them. Claire nodded once and walked quietly toward the service station. Victoria watched her go before lowering her voice. "Why does your father look like he has seen a ghost?" Ethan hesitated. "It is complicated." Victoria folded her gloves neatly onto the table. "Complicated usually means emotional. Your family does not do emotional." Ethan glanced toward the terrace where Richard still stood beneath the rain-covered glass, speaking urgently into his phone. "Apparently we do now." Victoria frowned slightly. "What is going on?" Ethan looked toward Claire again as she prepared the water tray near the counter. "That waitress may be connected to my father." Victoria gave a small, confused laugh. "Connected how?" Ethan lowered his voice further. "She might be his daughter." Silence. Victoria stared at him for several seconds before responding carefully. "You are serious?" Ethan nodded once. Victoria looked toward Claire again, this time differently. More closely. Not warmer. Simply calculating. "Does she know?" "Now she does." Victoria sat back slowly. "And your father believes this because of a necklace?" Ethan almost snapped at the dismissiveness in her voice before stopping himself. "Because only 2 nights ago, he would have said the exact same thing." "There is more to it than that," he answered quietly. Victoria crossed her arms. "Ethan, do you understand what happens if this becomes public?" He frowned. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" "It means your family name becomes tabloid entertainment by morning. Billionaire discovers secret daughter working as waitress in Manhattan restaurant. Do you really think shareholders will ignore that?" Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "That is your concern right now?" Victoria blinked slightly, surprised by his tone. "I am being realistic." "No," Ethan said quietly. "You are being cold." The words landed between them harder than either expected. Across the room, Claire approached with the sparkling water balanced carefully on a silver tray. Victoria's posture immediately smoothed itself back into polished composure. "Your water, ma'am," Claire said softly while placing the glass down. Victoria looked up at her with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you." Claire nodded politely and turned to leave again. But Richard suddenly re-entered the restaurant from the terrace, rain droplets still clinging to his coat sleeves. His expression looked shaken, urgent. He walked directly toward Claire without noticing Victoria at all. "Claire," he said breathlessly. She stopped immediately. Richard held an old hospital document tightly in one hand. "I just spoke to Massachusetts General." Ethan frowned. "Dad." Richard looked at Claire with trembling eyes filled equally with hope and fear. The records from the train accident survived. The room seemed to still around them. Claire's heartbeat quickened instantly. Richard swallowed hard before continuing. "And the child admitted that night under Eleanor Bennett's care, his voice cracked slightly, was registered with the last name Calloway." No one in the Imperial room spoke after Richard Calloway finished the sentence. The chandeliers above them continued glowing softly across crystal glasses and polished silverware, but the atmosphere beneath them had changed completely. Claire stood frozen beside the table, fingers tightening around the edge of the serving tray as though it were the only solid thing left in the room. Ethan stared at his father in disbelief. Victoria Ashford slowly lowered her champagne glass without taking her eyes off Claire. Richard stepped closer carefully, holding the hospital document like something sacred. "The nurse wrote your name as Claire Eleanor Calloway," he whispered. Claire's breath caught sharply. Her entire life, she had been Claire Bennett. Quiet waitress. Daughter of a struggling, single mother. Invisible girl from Queens. And now suddenly, in the middle of Manhattan beneath a room full of wealthy strangers, another name had been placed in front of her like a door she never asked to open. "My mother never used that name," Claire said softly. Richard nodded slowly. "Because she believed my family would destroy your life if they found you." Ethan looked away briefly, shame rising deeper with every passing minute. His grandfather had stolen 26 years from 2 people standing only feet away from him. And somehow Ethan himself had continued the same cruelty without even realizing it. Claire lowered her eyes toward the paper in Richard's hands. "Can I see it?" Richard handed her the document immediately. She read the faded lines silently while rain continued tapping softly against the restaurant windows. Date of admission. Injury report. Emergency contact. Then the name. Claire Eleanor Calloway. Her fingers trembled slightly, not because she cared about the wealth connected to that name, but because her mother had carried this truth alone for decades. Ethan noticed the emotion flickering carefully behind Claire's calm expression. "Did your mother know the records still existed?" he asked quietly. Claire shook her head once. She thought everything from the accident was lost. Richard's eyes softened painfully. She probably wanted it that way. Victoria finally spoke after several long seconds of silence. "This changes things." Ethan immediately looked at her coldly. "That is your first thought?" Victoria met his gaze calmly. "You are a public company CEO, Ethan. Your family story becoming front-page news absolutely changes things." Claire folded the paper carefully and handed it back to Richard. "Then nothing should become public." Richard frowned immediately. "Claire, I mean it." Her voice stayed gentle but firm now. "My mother spent her entire life protecting our privacy. I will not disrespect that because wealthy people suddenly discovered I exist." The sentence landed quietly but heavily across the table. Even Victoria looked slightly uncomfortable hearing it. Ethan studied Claire carefully. There was no greed in her voice, no excitement, no ambition, only dignity. And somehow that made him respect her more than anyone he had met in years. Richard looked devastated. "You are my daughter." Claire's eyes glistened softly beneath the chandelier light. "Maybe by blood." Richard flinched slightly. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows before continuing. "But my mother was the one who stayed awake when I had nightmares after the accident. She worked double shifts when rent was due. She skipped meals so I could afford school books." Her voice remained calm, steady, but Ethan could hear the years of quiet pain beneath every word. "You lost 26 years, Claire whispered softly. "But she lost her entire life waiting for answers." Richard looked down, unable to defend himself against a truth he never chose but still carried responsibility for. Nearby guests had stopped pretending not to listen now. Some watched openly. Others lowered their eyes in discomfort. Because there was something deeply unsettling about seeing a woman in a waitress uniform speak with more grace than the people who once had power over her life. Claire adjusted the pendant beneath her collar carefully. "I should go home." Richard stepped forward instinctively. "Please, let me come with you. I need to see Eleanor." Claire hesitated. Outside, thunder rolled softly over Manhattan again. Then she finally spoke the words that changed the entire night. "My mother has cancer," she said quietly. "Stage 4. The words seemed to drain all sound from the Imperial Room. Richard Calloway stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, staring at Claire as though the world had suddenly become unbearably fragile. Ethan felt his chest tighten beside him. Even Victoria Ashford looked shaken now, her polished composure cracking for the first time that evening. Claire lowered her eyes quietly after speaking, almost as if apologizing for delivering bad news she had spent too long carrying alone. "How long?" Richard finally whispered. Claire adjusted the strap of the serving tray against her arm before answering. "Almost a year." Richard looked devastated. "And she never told me." Claire gave a small sad smile. She did not think she had the right anymore. Ethan watched the pain move across his father's face with startling clarity. Richard was not mourning money, or reputation, or lost inheritance. He was mourning time, the one thing powerful people could never buy back once it disappeared. "What hospital?" Richard asked quickly. Claire hesitated. "She stopped treatment 3 months ago." Ethan frowned immediately. Why would she stop? Claire looked toward the rain outside the tall windows. "Because treatment costs money." Silence. Heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan suddenly remembered the tiny apartment above the laundromat. The old radiator Claire mentioned. The careful way she folded leftover bread into napkins after late shifts to bring home. Shame settled deeper inside him with every passing second. Richard looked horrified. "Claire." She gently shook her head before he could apologize again. "My mother did not want pity." "This is not pity," Richard said softly. "This is me realizing the woman I loved suffered alone while I spent 26 years sitting in boardrooms believing I had lost everything." Claire looked at him quietly. "She did not suffer alone. She had me." The simplicity of the sentence nearly broke him. Ethan looked toward Claire with growing respect that bordered on admiration now. She never exaggerated pain, never weaponized it. She simply carried it with quiet dignity while everyone around her slowly realized how blind they had been. Richard stepped closer carefully. "Please let me help her." Claire hesitated again. "She may not want to see you." Richard's eyes glistened. I deserve that. Claire looked down briefly before answering. Maybe, but she deserves peace more than revenge. Ethan felt the words settle heavily inside him. That was the difference between Claire and people like him. She protected others even when life gave her every reason not to. The restaurant manager approached nervously from across the room. Claire, he whispered carefully, your shift ended 20 minutes ago. Claire nodded politely. Thank you. She untied the black apron slowly and folded it neatly over her arm. The small action somehow felt enormous to Ethan, because only hours earlier he had looked at that uniform and seen someone beneath him. Now all he could see was the quiet strength hidden inside it. Richard reached for his coat immediately. I am coming with you. Claire looked uncertain. It is late. I do not care. His voice cracked slightly. I lost enough time already. Ethan stepped forward without thinking. I will drive. Claire looked surprised. Ethan met her gaze steadily. Queens is 40 minutes in this weather. Victoria stared at him. You are leaving? Ethan turned toward her calmly. Yes. For this? She asked softly. Ethan glanced toward Claire standing beneath the chandelier light, holding her folded apron like armor after battle. Then he looked back at Victoria. No, he answered quietly. For family. The word changed something in the room. Claire lowered her eyes immediately, emotion flickering carefully across her face before disappearing again. Richard looked at his son with quiet surprise, perhaps even pride. Outside, the rain had softened into mist drifting through the Manhattan streets. Claire slipped her coat on slowly while guests throughout the restaurant pretended not to watch. But everyone was watching, because there was something unforgettable about seeing a waitress leave beside two men who suddenly looked less like billionaires and more like people desperate for forgiveness. The drive to Queens felt quieter than the rain falling across the windshield. Manhattan's bright towers slowly disappeared behind them as Ethan guided the black sedan through wet midnight streets lined with corner stores, closed laundromats, and dim apartment windows glowing softly against the dark. Richard sat in the back seat without speaking, his hands clenched tightly around Eleanor's old letter. Claire sat beside the passenger window, watching the city blur past beneath streaks of rainwater and reflected headlights. None of them knew what waited at the end of the drive. That uncertainty filled the car heavier than conversation ever could. Ethan glanced toward Claire once at a red light. Does she know you were working tonight? Claire nodded slightly. She worries if I come home late. Richard closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. Every small detail hurt him now. The years he missed. The struggles he never saw. The ordinary moments he should have been part of. 26 years of birthdays. Christmas mornings. Hospital visits. First jobs. All gone. The car finally stopped outside the narrow brick building above the laundromat in Queens just after 1 in the morning. A flickering sign buzzed softly through the misty air while old dryers hummed behind the downstairs windows. Richard stared up at the building silently. This was where Eleanor had lived while he spent decades inside penthouses and corporate towers believing she abandoned him. Claire unlocked the front entrance quietly. She might be asleep. Richard nodded immediately. I understand. The stairwell smelled faintly of detergent and old paint. Ethan followed behind them, carrying the silence of a man seeing a completely different version of New York for the first time. Claire stopped outside apartment 4B with her hand resting lightly on the door handle. For a second, she looked uncertain, almost afraid. Then she opened the door softly. Warm lamplights spilled into the hallway. Eleanor Bennett sat awake beside the small kitchen table, wearing a pale blue sweater wrapped loosely around her thin shoulders. A teacup rested untouched beside her. She looked fragile now, smaller than Richard remembered, but her eyes remained exactly the same. The moment she saw him standing in the doorway, the cup slipped from her trembling fingers onto the table with a soft crack. No one moved. Rain tapped gently against the apartment windows while old radiator pipes clanged somewhere deep in the building walls. Eleanor slowly stood from the chair, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. Richard looked completely undone. Eleanor, he whispered. She stared at him for several long seconds before speaking. You got old. Richard let out the smallest broken laugh through wet eyes. So did you. Claire quietly stepped aside, giving them space neither of them knew how to cross anymore. Ethan remained near the doorway, suddenly feeling like an outsider witnessing something sacred. Eleanor looked toward the letter still clutched in Richard's hands. You kept it. Richard nodded once. Every day. Her eyes filled immediately with tears she had clearly spent years refusing to shed. I thought your father destroyed it. Richard stepped forward slowly. Carefully. He destroyed a lot of things. Eleanor lowered her gaze briefly. I tried to hate you. Richard's voice cracked softly. I never stopped loving you. The apartment fell silent again. Claire looked away toward the rain-covered window, giving her mother privacy she deserved after carrying heartbreak alone for so long. Ethan watched Claire quietly then. Her small apartment, the second-hand furniture, the medicine bottles near the sink, the exhaustion hidden beneath her calmness. And suddenly he understood something that changed him permanently. Wealth had never made his family powerful. Love had, and the absence of it had nearly destroyed every person standing in that room. Eleanor finally looked toward Claire. You brought him here. Claire nodded gently. You deserve the truth. Eleanor smiled sadly through tears. No, she whispered. I think all of us did. Richard slowly crossed the remaining distance between them, and for the first time in 26 years, Eleanor Bennett allowed him to hold her hand again. Winter arrived softly over New York in the weeks that followed. The rain eventually disappeared from the streets, replaced by thin layers of snow resting quietly along sidewalks and fire escapes across Queens. Life did not suddenly become perfect for the people inside apartment 4B. Eleanor was still sick. Some mornings were harder than others. Some nights were filled with silence heavy enough to feel like grief sitting beside them at the kitchen table. But something important had changed. No one carried the weight alone anymore. Richard Calloway began visiting every evening after work, often arriving with groceries Eleanor never asked for and books Claire casually mentioned wanting weeks earlier. He never treated kindness like charity. That mattered to Claire more than he understood. Sometimes he simply sat beside Eleanor listening to old jazz records while snow drifted outside the apartment windows. Other times he apologized quietly for things too large to fully repair. Eleanor never asked him to beg for forgiveness. Age had taught her that bitterness only made suffering lonelier. One snowy Sunday morning, Ethan arrived carrying coffee and a paper bag filled with pastries from a bakery downtown. Claire opened the apartment door wearing an oversized gray sweater and looked genuinely surprised to see him standing there without a suit jacket or security driver. You know rich people usually sleep until noon on Sundays, she said softly. Ethan almost smiled. I am trying a new personality. Claire laughed quietly for the first time since he met her. The sound caught him completely off guard. Warm, honest, human. It changed the entire room. Ethan started visiting more often after that. Not out of obligation. Because somewhere between the restaurant and Queens, he had realized success meant very little if it erased your ability to see people clearly. He helped Claire move Eleanor's medical equipment one afternoon without being asked. Another evening, he repaired the broken kitchen cabinet door while Richard and Eleanor argued gently over old songs from the 1980s. Slowly, awkwardly, the shape of a family began forming inside the small apartment above the laundromat. Not perfect, not polished, but real. A month later, Claire returned to work at the Imperial Room for the first time since everything changed. The chandeliers still glowed the same way. The piano still echoed softly through the dining room. Wealth still sat comfortably behind crystal glasses and expensive watches. But Claire walked differently now. Not because she discovered she belonged to a powerful family. Because she finally understood she had never been invisible in the first place. Near the end of her shift, Ethan entered the restaurant quietly, wearing a dark wool coat dusted with snowflakes. Several employees immediately straightened nervously at the sight of the CEO. But Ethan ignored all of them and walked directly toward Claire near the service station. Table for two? She asked softly. Ethan shook his head once. Actually, I came to apologize properly. Claire looked amused. You already apologized. Not publicly. Before she could stop him, Ethan turned toward the dining room and spoke clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. A few weeks ago, I treated someone here as though her job determined her worth. The restaurant slowly fell quiet around him. Ethan looked directly at Claire. I was wrong. No speech followed. No dramatic performance. Just truth spoken simply beneath warm chandelier light. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Not because of the apology itself, but because powerful people almost never admitted when they failed someone without trying to protect their pride first. Ethan stepped closer carefully. My father spent years searching for what he lost, he said quietly. I think I spent years becoming someone I did not even recognize. Claire looked at him gently. People change when they finally learn what matters. Snow drifted softly beyond the tall restaurant windows, while warm golden light reflected across the polished floors. Somewhere near the piano, someone began clapping quietly. Then another person joined. And another. Not because Claire became part of a wealthy family, but because dignity has a strange way of silencing rooms once people finally recognize it. Later that night, Claire stepped outside beneath the falling snow and looked up at the Manhattan skyline glowing against the winter sky. Her phone buzzed gently inside her coat pocket. A message from Richard. Family dinner tomorrow. Eleanor says you still overwork yourself. Claire smiled softly to herself before slipping the phone away. Some wounds never fully disappear. Some years can never be returned. But sometimes life gives people one final chance to become kinder than the world that hurt them. And maybe that is enough. If this story touched something quiet inside you, perhaps it is because we have all wanted to be seen for who we truly are at least once in our lives. Thank you for being here. And if stories like this still matter to you, you are always welcome to stay for the next one.